Hi everyone, this is Professor Hawkins, and welcome to our, third attempt to make the virtual mythology lecture a thing that is successful and easy. What you're looking at here is the face, if you will, of HAL 9000, the sentient computer from Stanley Kubrick's amazing film 2001, A Space Odyssey. Very good classical reference there. But I'm increasingly worried that the technical problems that turned HAL into a misanthropic computer may be somewhat at play with this lecture. Hopefully we'll get through it. So without further ado, here we go. This lecture is designed to help us synthesize, expand, and reflect on creation myths in Hesiod. And we're going to do that by looking at Hesiod and his poetry itself, but also looking at a wider context. This lovely image here by Juhi Yoon is an illustration from Barry Powell's article, The Big Bang is Hard Science, It is Also a Creation Story. This is hot linked here and available through Carmen, and Barry Powell is a classicist at the University of Wisconsin who has taken a little more time and elaborated a little more fully the basic point that I have made in class, that even though the Big Bang is a scientific and seemingly data-driven sort of explanation of where the universe comes from, it also has a narration, and it is a creation story every bit as much as what we find in, for example, the Hebrew Bible or Hesiod. So give that a look when you have a moment. And here's our roadmap for the day. The question that's on everyone's mind, where did Miami come from? Then we'll move into connections between the theogony and the works and days. Then we'll ask what binds these two seemingly quite different stories together. And finally, I'll suggest one explanation, potential explanation, for why Hesiod was telling these particular stories at this particular historical moment. So let's start with the creation of Miami. Why are we starting here? Well, because Andrew Ortazzo, aka Bobby Foster, has put together this rather catchy and flamboyant artistic set of visuals to go with his text of what he calls simply the Miami creation myth. He is a resident of Miami and loves his city, and decided that he wanted to give his city an origin myth. As we think about what he has done, we can understand it as a very rough parallel to what ancient audiences of Hesiod might have been experiencing. I've linked here, and I'll make them available on Carmen, an interview with Andrew Ortazzo, and also linked the text of his creation myth. Now, what Ortazzo has done in this work is to give a sense of what Miami is. Now, of course, if you wanted to figure that out in terms of, say, American history, or in terms of the geological backstory to southern Florida, you could go to all manner of fact-driven, detailed accounts of how the city of Miami came to be what it is today. But that's not really what Ortazzo was interested in. He's interested in telling you the story of how Miami came to be the kind of city it is today. Not so much historically, not so much geologically, but in terms of the vibe of what Miami is. And you can see immediately here with the mixture of different skin tones on these figures, the flamboyant figure wearing a necklace, smoking a cigar, and wearing a little banana hammock here on the beach, is giving us a sense of something unique about Miami, and something that Ortazzo thinks is deserving of having its own story. Now, Ortazzo did this by drawing together lots of different influences from the city around him. If you read the text, you'll realize that it has lots of different influences in terms of its language construction, from Haitian Creole, Jamaican dialects, English, Spanish, all sorts of things like this, but also from different patterns of storytelling, including, you can find hints in there of classical mythology. So as we think about Hesiod, you might judge your reaction to Ortazzo's creation and imagine what ancient audiences of Hesiod might have thought. He gives us stories, but perhaps there were people in the audience who said, hey, I could tell that differently, or better, or I heard a different version, or that's not the version that makes sense in my local part of Greece. And all of those reactions are possible and perfectly legitimate, because what Ortazo, like Hesiod, has done is to give us a specific vision of what creation means at a particular moment in time and space. So what draws together these two stories that we've been studying, Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days? They seem so strikingly different. Just to begin with the titles, the word theogony is something that I suspect most of us don't know until we hear the etymology of the two words that are built into this from ancient Greek, that this is the story of the birth of the gods. Whereas Works and Days has a title that is super easy to understand in terms of the words, but perhaps a little perplexing. What exactly does that mean to have works and days be the theme or title of a poem? Beyond that, the Theogony is consumed with issues of the divine world, the origins of the universe, the creation of the gods, whereas the Works and Days is a very human text. It's a story about a man who feels jilted by his brother trying to deal with family inheritance. What could be more pedestrian, what could be more human than an issue like that? But if there's something that binds these texts together, it's the figure of Zeus. And it's the figure of Zeus specifically in his role as the provider and guarantor of a stable cosmic order, and as the authority behind a system of justice. And those two things, the idea of Zeus's order and Zeus's justice, may end up blurring together and almost becoming the same thing. But notice that even in the Works and Days, which is our more human text, that Hesiod begins by talking about Zeus and how it is Zeus who has the power to make a human worthy of having stories be told about him or her, or unworthy. And so Zeus is the figure that looms over both of these texts. Zeus is the figure who comes into being in the Theogony. Zeus is the figure in the Theogony who takes a changeable universe in which we can move easily from chaos to the reign of Uranos and Gaia, to the reign of Kronos and Rhea, to something that is going to stay in place. Zeus is not just the next god, he is the last of the great gods in terms of the story that Hesiod tells us. And by the end of the Theogony, we can feel confident that Zeus's rule, even when he's not necessarily very benevolently disposed towards human, is stable and knowable and permanent. What that means for the Works and Days is that the human narrative that unfolds is told against the backdrop of the order that Zeus provides. There is a way for the world to work, and we humans can align ourselves with that, or we can align ourselves against it. And Hesiod's point in this poem is to urge his brother, however fictitious that storyline might be, to align himself more with, rather than against, the desires of Zeus. Now, keeping in mind our reactions to Ortazo's story of the origin of Miami, we can recognize that if we could get Perses, Hesiod's brother, to tell us his version of the story, it may well be that he feels like, or at least is going to justify his actions in terms of an alignment with Zeus's divine order. The other aspect that Zeus brings is justice. Both poems are consumed with the idea of justice. It is just for Zeus to rise up against his father because Kronos has been doing something that is unjust with his and Rhea's children. It is also just for Zeus to fight off challengers to his rule, such as the Titans and the giants, because Zeus is the guarantor of our world order. Now notice that the only way that this justice is really authorized is from a system within Zeus's own world. He is justified in maintaining his order because he doesn't want to lose it. If we could, again, hear the voice of Kronos, Kronos might tell us, for example, that it was just for him to rise up against his father Uranos and to sever his father's penis with that sickle. More on that in a moment. He might also tell us that it was unjust for Zeus to have usurped Kronos' role in the cosmic order. But that is because from the perspective of the loser, it's natural that it seems unjust, whereas Zeus is able to equate his victory with a kind of justice, a new kind of justice that comes with his reign. So as Hesiod is looking at the division of the family wealth in Works and Days, it's understandable that when he gets the smaller portion, he feels that something is unjust. Does that mean that it's unjust by some universal standard? We, of course, have no idea. Perhaps their parents felt that Perses was a better son or a needier son than was Hesiod, and so they intentionally gave him more of the family inheritance than they gave to Hesiod. Perhaps Perses' parents thought it was just that he got more. But within our poem, in the Works and Days, Hesiod tells us that what is just is his own vision of an alignment between the human world and the world of Zeus. Notice that both Hesiod and Zeus are thus in the rhetorical position of needing to fend off challenges from the outside. Zeus has to overcome his father Kronos, but then also he has to fight off the Titans and the giants, whereas Hesiod, within the Works and Days, has to fend off the attacks, if you will, of his brother Perses. So order and justice, as understood through the vision and the figure of Zeus, is what unites these two poems together. We might, however, now ask where these stories came from. Did Hesiod make these up by himself? In the Works and Days, for example, Hesiod tells us that he was a shepherd and that the Muses taught him how to tell poetry. I just said that was in the Works and Days. That's wrong. That was in the Theogony, that he was a shepherd and the Muses taught him how to tell poetry. And so perhaps it's the gift of the Muses that gave him the inspiration to come up with these stories. And yet scholars who look at these narratives have determined that there are very strikingly similar story patterns that come from the Near East. That is roughly to say what we would call today the Middle East, ancient Mesopotamia, the coast of what is today Turkey and Israel, down into ancient Egypt. There is, for example, a Hurrian myth of three divine figures called Anu, Kumarbi, and Teshub. The Hurrians were a people of ancient Mesopotamia, and it was only in the last century that this myth was discovered. And what the basic storyline is, I'm not going to give you all the details, but the basic storyline goes like this. Anu is a sky god, and he is overthrown by his son, Kumarbi. In the act of overthrowing his father, Kumarbi bites off the penis and testicles of his father, Anu. After that, Kumarbi's son, Teshub, rises up against Kumarbi. I hope that sounds quite familiar, because this is, as people noted as soon as this story was discovered, that this sounds an awfully lot like Uranos, Kronos, and Zeus, as told in the Greek succession myth in the Theogony. Now notice we have here to the right an image of Kumarbi from the 9th century BCE, and in his left hand he's holding his father's penis, ew, and in his right hand he's holding a sickle. This image suggests that there was also a version of the story in which Kumarbi did not bite off his father's genitals, but rather he used a sickle to slice them off. Now that is particularly interesting because that comes so close to the precise detail of what Hesiod tells us in the Theogony. It suggests also that the story about Kumarbi's attack on his father was told differently, and we can see that Hesiod may well have been following the version of the myth that is more reflective in what we see here in the visuals than in the storyline that I told you, which was preserved in a text. As for the works and days, we know from ancient Egyptian and Sumerian literary traditions that there was a style of literature called wisdom literature. It's sometimes called the mirror of princes. And in this genre of literature, someone, it can be an advisor, it can be a father, it can be a brother, is giving advice to another figure. Again, a king, a son, a brother, something along these lines. And there are texts that are strikingly similar to what we find in the basic narrative of the works and days. So whereas Hesiod is giving his brother a lecture on ethics in hopes of changing his brother's behavior, perhaps reversing the division of the family inheritance, in Egyptian and Sumerian wisdom literature that predates Hesiod's story, we can see strikingly similar patterns. Now, does this mean that Hesiod is simply derivative? No, of course not. Every musician that you've ever listened to, every visual artist whose work you've ever looked at, has been influenced by traditions and individuals that came before him or her. So just so, Hesiod is perhaps giving us hints of what his influences were, whether he knew, for example, the names Anu, Kumarbi, and Teshub doesn't matter, but he's giving us a hint of where these stories may have come from, and yet he's giving us his own very particular version of it. You hear a gospel song like, say, Amazing Grace, and every time you hear it, you're going to hear something different that perhaps you like somewhat better or somewhat worse. So too, Hesiod is giving us his own particular innovations on a very traditional set of basic storylines. What I just set out with the last slide suggests that there may be an important aspect of historical and physical connection in mythical storytelling. We can easily imagine that storytellers from among the ancient Hurrians, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Greeks, were all interacting in different ways. This could have happened through trading, it could have happened through warfare, it could have happened through gathering slaves in the process of military conquest. And the stories that come together as people groups mix can lead to the kind of connections that I was just setting out. But what do we do with something like the story of Papa and Rangi? This came from very early in our semester, and this takes us back to New Zealand and the Maori people. Ranginui and Papatuanuku, known as Rangi and Papa, are figures that are strikingly similar to the myth that we know about Uranos and Gaia. Heaven and earth are stuck together in a sexual embrace, and they have to be separated before the world as we know it can come into existence. In the Maori version, a divine figure named Tane is able to physically separate his mother and father, and so he stands as a barrier between them, rather like the figure of Atlas does in Ovid's account of the flood myth that we will read later in the term. But it also sounds quite like the story that Hesiod tells us about how Kronos separated Uranos and Gaia with that fateful sickle. So should we wonder if Hesiod was somehow influenced by or an influence on Maori storytelling traditions? That seems pretty unlikely, right, in terms of the physical separation between New Zealand and the Mediterranean. And so we have to come up with different possible explanations about how it is that in groups that are physically or historically or culturally separated from one another, we can end up with the same or quite similar story pattern. Sometimes we can come up with specific explanations that seem satisfying. What if, for example, a European colonizer came to New Zealand and asked the local storytellers if they had any creation myths? Perhaps the Maori storyteller said, what do you mean by creation myth? And the Europeans said, well, what if it's something like this? And related the story of Hesiod that they had learned in school. Perhaps the Maori storyteller said, I can give you something like that. Whether he was making it up or whether he was adapting an old story, he comes up with the story that we know of Papa and Rangi. If that doesn't sound convincing either, we might look to, for example, psychological hardwiring of the human mind. Is there a way in which we think of the sky as inherently and fundamentally male, whereas the earth is inherently and fundamentally female, and the interaction between the two is some sort of marital, sexual interaction that leads to the generation of the world around us? That's possible. And this psychological perspective on mythology suggests that the hard wiring of the human brain is predisposed to telling certain kinds of myths. So it's natural and understandable that even people who have been in no direct contact or even indirect contact within any historical record might come up with strikingly similar storylines. If that doesn't seem plausible to you, we might turn to, for example, environmental factors. What if there are experiences that are universal, not because of the human mind, but because of the way human societies work in the natural environment? Floods, tidal waves, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes may perhaps impel people to tell similar kinds of stories in very different situations. Later in the semester, when we talk about flood myths, this will be a very appealing potential explanation. Every society that has ever been susceptible to floods may have some sort of flood myth that sounds an awful lot like that which is most famously known from the Hebrew Bible and the story of Noah. Ultimately, we can't know why Papa and Rangi's story is so strikingly similar to that of Ouranos and Gaia, but we can come up with more or less compelling hypotheses. Maybe you'll be able to come up with an explanation that I haven't thought of and share it with the rest of us someday. If so, you might want to get a grant to go do some research on the beach in New Zealand. Next, let's move into the question of why Hesiod told these myths at this particular time. We have this backstory now that Hesiod may have been inspired by some Near Eastern traditions, and yet he was certainly giving his own particular innovations and artistic nuances. So why did he tell this story at this time? Well, the first thing we have to do is figure out when was Hesiod's time, and this we can answer quite simply that most scholars believe he was working roughly around 700 BCE. So let's take that as our starting point. What was going on in 700 BCE becomes the next question, and to answer that, we need to have a very rough and very quick overview of Greek historical eras. The Bronze Age is a developmental age in human society that happens in lots of cultures around the globe, and typically is between the Stone Age, when tools and weapons are made simply out of stone, and a more advanced metallurgical era such as the use of iron. The Bronze Age can happen at different times in different places, but the Greek Bronze Age roughly lasted from 3000 to 1100 BCE. This era of Greek history involved a kind of writing that I show here, known as Linear B. Has a very different script from what we know of as classical ancient Greek. Essentially a different alphabet. And this was an era in which archaeological evidence suggests that society was controlled by a handful of very highly fortified, very intensively urbanized palace structures that were scattered across the Greek world. It starts to sound a good bit like what we know of from Homeric poetry, where we hear of kings and great cities with huge fortifications. And indeed, what Homer is, in many ways, is a projection of the Bronze Age past. It may or may not be accurate, we'll take that up later in the term to some extent, but it's a projection, it's a fantasy about what Bronze Age Greece may have been like. So keep in mind two things as we move on from the Bronze Age. One is this idea of intensively, highly developed, highly urbanized palace structures, and the other, this kind of writing known as Linear B. After the Bronze Age, we have what we call the Dark Age from about 1100 to 800 BCE. So we're getting close to Hesiod's era, but we're not there yet. And this period is known as the Dark Age simply because we, from our historical vantage, can't see much into what's going on. What we do know is that those huge palace structures from the Bronze Age were abandoned. There is no more evidence of writing, whether Linear B or anything else, in ancient Greece. And it seems that society must have collapsed from a very high level of development to something that looks like a very simple sort of village structure that was scattered all over the Greek world. After the Greek age, society begins to have again an uptick in terms of what we can see from our historical record. And we come to the Archaic Age, from the years 800 to 500 BCE. In this era, a new kind of political structure is developed called the polis. This is the word that gives us, for example, our word today, politics. What is politics? Politics is the ordering of our civic unit, whether that be your city or town, your state, or your nation. The polis was something more complicated, seemingly, and on a larger scale than what the ancient palace structures were, but it also came with a lot of internal developments that made the Archaic Age strikingly different from what we can understand of the Bronze Age. So, for example, a new form of warfare was developed called the phalanx, and here we see an ancient artistic depiction of a phalanx. If you look closely at this image, what you see is a line of warriors who have heavy helmets and heavy shields, but not a lot of other armor, and they are standing next to each other in close formation, their spears held up over their shoulders. Now, if we contrast this setup in which warriors are working together in close formation and close orchestration, in which each warrior covers part of his own body and part of his neighbor's body with his shield, and in which the unit, the entire phalanx, ends up being something like a single tool in the process of war. If we contrast all this with the images that we have of Bronze Age warfare, we can see that this is radically different. For example, in the Homeric projection of Bronze Age warfare, again quite possibly a fantasy, what we see is that the tide of war turns based on which army has the most impressive leading figures. And a few massively armored warriors would come out and do one-on-one battle with each other. And to a large extent, the regular troops in the army were essentially just pawns. So we'll see, for example, that in the Trojan War, the Trojans do well when their hero Hector is on the battlefield, but Achilles, the Greek hero, is not. As soon as Achilles comes back onto the court, as it were, to use a basketball metaphor, the tide of war turns. Because what's important in Bronze Age warfare is which side has the single greatest warrior. In the archaic phalanx, by contrast, the team will win that has the better coordination of soldiers. Not necessarily the best individuals, but the best coordination and orchestration among a larger number of warriors. An archaic phalanx could presumably wipe an individual like Achilles off the map, but not because any of the individuals is superior to Achilles, but rather because they work in better coordination. A little reminiscence of Yuval Harari's idea about large-scale human coordinated activities. In addition to the phalanx, we get a new kind of writing. It turns out that Linear B and what we see here, which is a very early form of classical Greek, are essentially the same languages, but they're written in wholly different scripts, different alphabets, as if, for example, we started writing English using the Greek alphabet. We could do that. We could make the same sounds. We could make all the same words that we use today, but the script that we use to write would look different than what we think of as standard English. So the Archaic Age is wildly different from the Bronze Age, and also, importantly, it's not in direct contact with it, because in that period from 1100 to 800 that we call the Dark Age, we simply don't know what was going on in ancient Greece. Now, one thing that you'll notice I mentioned is that from the Bronze Age to the Dark Age, it seems that we have a major step backwards in terms of cultural development. This is a huge topic that we can touch on only briefly, but it's known as the Bronze Age collapse. And sometime around the end of the Bronze Age, the entire region of the Eastern Mediterranean, the ancient Near East, ancient Egypt, all of these cultures experienced extreme threats, if not outright collapse. You can see, for example, with these little flames that are on this map, that there are lots of structures across the Greek world that were burned, and essentially these palace structures came to an end. So here we have, at a very similar state across the Eastern Mediterranean, a very rapid depopulation, decentralization, and a loss of overall cultural development in terms of what we can see from the historical record. What does this mean for Hesiod and his world? Well, I'm going to suggest that we do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that Hesiod is standing in this picture that I have here. This is the part of the archaeological remains of ancient Mycenae, one of the great Bronze Age palace structures from ancient Greece. And you can see that there's this massive gateway that has around it huge blocks. If you think about this as being, I think it's roughly 8 feet high, the gateway, maybe even 10 feet high that one would pass through, you can sense that the stones that are involved in the building of this outer wall of this palace structure are absolutely enormous. On top of that, you have the highly ornate, although it's a little tough to see here, keystone above the gate, in which there are 2 very carefully carved lions. This is really amazing stuff on any level. But if you were Hesiod, roughly 700 BCE, standing there after the Dark Ages had effectively cut off the historical transmission of the realities of the Bronze Age world, what would you make of this space? Who were the people who had put together this kind of wall, this kind of art, this kind of palace structure that you yourself in 700 BCE could not create? Perhaps it would impel a storyteller like Hesiod to give us a story of decline. A story, for example, in which once upon a time there was a golden age that were like the gods, a silver age that were almost as good, a Bronze Age, notice there that the mythical and the historical eras overlap, a Bronze Age in which great warriors fought huge battles. Perhaps it was then, in this earlier race of humanity, that something like this palace was built. Next, we get the Age of Heroes, according to Hesiod. And in that era, specifically, he tells us that the members of that era died out fighting at places like the city of Troy. This may be a Hesiodic recollection of the Bronze Age collapse, something that perhaps had been handed down from storyteller to storyteller into his era. It also will allow us a point of connection later in the semester as we move into Trojan era mythology. But let's also flip the script completely. What if Hesiod was standing here as part of a civic festival at the city of Argos, the classical era city that's quite close to Mycenae? So we have the Bronze Age ruins next to the classical era city of Argos. And if Hesiod were working in that context, he might be looking back at the ruins of this ancient era and suggesting to his audience something more uplifting, something involved perhaps with civic pride that perhaps gives us a narrative of progress. Do you want to understand why the archaic polis, not that Hesiod would have called it archaic, he would have said the contemporary polis, our world that we have around us, is so great? Well, let me tell you the story about how once upon a time there was chaos. And after that came Uranos and Gaia, who were powerful, but kind of primitive, kind of blunt, not very narratively interesting. And the world of humanity could not even come into existence at the time of Uranos and Gaia because they were locked in that eternal embrace. Then came the realm of Kronos and Rhea, an era in which the top divinity in the world was gobbling down babies, sort of a brutal, savage era. And we can feel good that we live in an era that's more stable than that, more ordered by a sense of justice that is good and proper because it's authorized by the figure of Zeus. So we can imagine that Hesiod, like any good performance artist, can give us a couple of different riffs. One in which we can lament how far the world has fallen, and we can lament the fact that we're members of the Iron Age. Or flip it around and we can feel very good about ourselves and the progress that our society has made, especially when compared to the Dark Age, just a few generations before. So Hesiod may well be telling us precisely these stories, this pair of seemingly contrasting stories, because of precisely the historical moment that he was working in. That's it for now, and I hope that you got a lot out of this abbreviated version of our synthesis and expansion of creation myths, and we'll continue on with flood narratives next week in our mythological study, and beyond that we'll be moving into the gods, and very soon after that the stories of the Homeric and Trojan sagas. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.